Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Renegade Operative. Today, I wanted to touch base on a minuscule subject that is slightly overlooked in the prospect of lore. It's a constant reminder of literary setup that sells us on the importance of context clues. We're talking about the effectiveness of notes that are left behind in survival horror games, talking on how they convey some frightful intensity for a situation. It's easy to assume as a Let's Player that things are being readily ignored and not read for the sake of not wanting to repeat notes to the audience. These circumstances occur in my very own Let's Plays where I harbor a pretty known disinterest to read scribblings verbatim, opting for the audience to pause the video where they see fit at a specific point to gather all the information for themselves. It would be a pretty well-known mistake to assume that my laziness doesn't mean that I'm not engrossed into these scribblings as soon as I see them. I think it hit me pretty hard when I was reading the notes for The Last of Us and Resident Evil that these were once normal, peaceful people doing their 9-to-5 jobs before fate took away their normal way of life. These documents can boil down to specific notions that leaves a vivid imagination as to what happened to these other characters during their mental disarray. These findings could be also very informative to give information on how this particular universe is crafted. We could be listening to some very psychotic ramblings of a mad doctor. We could be hearing about the biology of specific creatures. We could be hearing about the sorrow that centers on a person's mind one final time before they say goodbye to their family and their loved ones upon the discovery of infection. I always thought these notes ran parallel to what I would be possibly thinking personally if I was thrusted into a situation like this. As ridiculous as it sounds, it's true. We know this is a fictional work. Video games are a part of an entertaining pastime that isn't meant to blend the standards of reality. This is the one time I would make an honest exception to the rule when discovering the staying power that a note leaves on you. What if you were forced to shoot someone who isn't human anymore, someone you love, someone you care about deeply, just to save your own skin? How would you feel afterwards? How would you react? This is the genius behind good writing, which conveys emotion, especially when the story illustrates how dire things can be. I think one of my favorite things about a survival horror game is when the player character is also feeling these same sentiments. These sentiments include the fear of death by mentioning that this fatal end via scribblings could have been the same fate for the player character. Silent Hill is the perfect example of nonsensical writings being warped, manipulated, or even disappearing at times from your inventory to show that there is a tease of illusion that maybe the player character is the one that is truly disturbed by the mental hauntings. While notes can be used to convey the importance of the main plot, they can also show backstory that didn't get enough screen time in various cinematics. Now, I do think there is a slight criticism here when they have situations where major plot details are always regulated to notes and not shown in cutscenes at all, especially when these supposed character traits weren't obvious 5 seconds ago. Now they rear its ugly head. Then we come to find out that is all quoted somewhere to our confusion, so I can see why that could be slightly annoying. However, after mentioning Silent Hill, I do believe a writer could perfect subtlety if done right. With or without that note, I think we should have a clear glimpse of that character's downward spiral. This should all correlate to the evidence presented with the notes in our inventory about that character, alluding to their behavior as a perfect frame of reference between reading along with visualization of the cutscene itself. The reason why I mention this is because the way Resident Evil 6 handles notes is awful. There's things that happen in the notes of Resident Evil 6 that we don't get privy to or we don't see. Like, how are we supposed to know that Leon was suicidal during the Raccoon City incident when that's never shown, never seen, never conveyed, never talked about, only mentioned in that game as a passing reference? You figure something like that important, something boiling in the character's mind would be illustrated in Resident Evil 2, but no, it's not. It's just brought up in Resident Evil 6 as a passing reference. The same goes for leaving stuff completely off the table when it comes to the reference of the other characters in relation to another one with their interpersonal relationship. Like, I know Jill Valentine was in quarantine by the time that Resident Evil 6 happened. However, she didn't talk about Chris being gone on that whole PTSD bender when he had amnesia and he was completely like gone for 6 months. Nothing was mentioned, nothing was said. Did she talk about it? Hell no. This is never brought up ever in the entirety of RE6 or Revelations 2, and I swear to God, it's so stupid that they left that out, that Jill would not be worried about her best friend, that it doesn't make sense. The man is missing. Goddamn, do something, mother. I almost swore there for a second. Let's just hope that Resident Evil 6 doesn't make any more blunders to the timeline going forward, more than it already has. But that's none of my business. That's more of Capcom's business going forward. I do think that notes are a good diverging point from the story, so we wouldn't want to waste too much time if the former got too much screen time with clunky exposition and shoving a letter in your face every 2 seconds. That just wouldn't make good gameplay. So it needs to be the perfect balance of enough main story whilst keeping the important backstories reasonably prevalent. I just have to admit that I'm a sucker for putting the puzzle together if we find a strewn out body that had a story to them before they collapsed. If we're simply talking about surface level replies, then it might feel like this could be a cheap off-screen death, but you do realize that this was a person, or this could have been a place of normality that you discovered, or something inhuman was created as a byproduct here. The fall of man has been exhibited in post-apocalyptic genres for ages now. I think these notes aren't really giving any exceptions to the rule here. I think one of my favorite ways that this is handled is when it was presented in The Last of Us. You see Joel and Ellie commenting on how they feel about things around them, even getting into somewhat heated discussions about how people thought at that time and how they met their fate. This humanizes these characters even more so, since you can glean some sympathy from them. I wasn't really a big fan of characters just picking up these notes with no comments to them of the sort. I was pretty damn thrilled to see Resident Evil 2 Remake re-implement those sort of notions and ideas from those characters when viewing said notes. I love seeing when the player character has something to say. If we also want to get technical, then there's many Easter eggs or puzzle solutions that can be solved through collectible documentation, which enhances their usefulness. You can go from watching dioramas of previous Resident Evil haunts while also using these final scribblings that someone wrote to get through the next passage or find the next safe box with all these extra goodies of ammunition inside of it. It only serves to increase the level of exploration as you go on the hunt for these things around these giant complexes. Tips are always a big hint to save the next survivor, which is you. I assume it's always worth it thinking about how these walking monstrosities might have weaknesses to them detailed by these scientists. At the end of the day, reading about the history of these characters, reading about the story behind all these things going on in a post-apocalyptic world and a video game, it might seem boring to some people. I know it might seem mundane. I get that vibe here. But I think the random writings and the diaries in horror games has been one of the most effective means of conveying how the world is in panic from other survivors, how they don't want you to end up like them, how they lost everything in the midst of these events that transpired. You're stuck teetering on the edge and you want to find out more. You start thinking to yourself if your luck as a player character is going to run out for the next encounter like theirs. I can safely say without a shadow of a doubt that I hope this does not change in the future, and despite some nitpicks with the cutscenes not conveying certain pieces of key information in certain arcs, I do think there's always room for improvement. They could always give us more methodical context clues to piece together as we see the aftermath. Movies, for example, they really don't have the same luxuries as video games to trim the fat from the plot if things are inconsequential in terms of of how these notes are presented. So the gamers, they do get a little something extra along with important and inconsequential notes. It's a little something to siphon through with this process that gives you a lot more backstory to read. This is why notes will forever remain important in survival horror experiences. It lays the groundwork for each desolate area. The true isolation of loneliness will kick in as you read these final journeys. Let's just hope that Itchy Scott finally gets some reading comprehension, since those zombies aren't getting any smarter. This is Renegade Operative signing off. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video about the effectiveness of notes in survival horror games and my overall discussion or thoughts on them as well. Hopefully you guys really like this video. Once again, be sure to slap that like button. It really helps me a lot. Be sure to comment, tell me what you thought of the video, subscribe, all that jazz. You know how it is. Click open the description and find me on social media, or watch this splash page and follow me everywhere you possibly can. Anyway, this is Renegade Operative signing out. Hopefully you had a good night. Be good people, and I'll see you next time. Later.